Welcome to Dead Scary Stories. We have some disturbing and scary horror stories for you tonight. If you enjoy these stories, please like, comment, or subscribe. Otherwise, lie back, relax, and let sleep consume you. It started as a faint static on my radio. I was a hobbyist, always tinkering with my equipment in my small workshop, but this was different. The crackling sound morphed into a series of rhythmic beeps and pulses, reminiscent of some kind of coded message. Intrigued, I recorded the sequence, convinced it was a breakthrough in my search for extraterrestrial life. Weeks turned into months as I became engrossed in the mystery of the signal. Each night I would huddle in front of my aging radio, headphones clamped over my ears, my heart racing in anticipation. The beeps grew more distinct, almost insistent, as if they were aware I was listening. A thrill surged through me. This was the moment I had always dreamed of. But that excitement was quickly overshadowed by an unease that began to settle in the back of my mind. One night, while reviewing the recordings, I noticed something strange. Beneath the beeps there was a voice. Soft at first, almost inaudible, but as I cranked up the volume, it became clearer. It was a chilling chant, layered with a rhythm that felt otherworldly, sending shivers down my spine. I tried to brush it off, convincing myself it was just interference, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was calling to me, begging for my attention. That night I had a dream, vivid and unsettling. I stood in a vast, dark void, surrounded by swirling stars that pulsed like distant hearts. A figure emerged from the darkness, tall and slender, with elongated limbs and eyes that glowed like dying stars. It reached out to me, and I felt a cold wave of dread wash over me as I was drawn into its gaze. I woke up gasping, drenched in sweat, the echoes of the voice still swirling in my mind. Days passed in a haze, filled with paranoia and sleepless nights. Shadows flickered at the corners of my vision, and I heard whispers that seemed to drift just beyond the reach of comprehension. The atmosphere around me felt charged, as if something was lurking just outside the threshold of my awareness. Friends began to notice my unease, but I brushed it off, determined to unravel the mystery of the signal. One evening, while I was absorbed in my recordings, the beeping escalated into a frantic crescendo. My heart raced as I felt compelled to respond. I tuned my radio to the frequency and focused, willing myself to understand. Suddenly, the voice surged back to life, louder than ever, its urgency palpable. It felt as though the message was not just meant to be heard, but also to be answered. Before I fully understood what was happening, I grabbed my microphone and began speaking, my voice trembling in the silence. The moment I spoke, the lights in my house flickered violently. I froze, panic flooding my veins as the voice responded, echoing my own words back to me, but twisted and distorted. The beeping morphed into a frenzied rhythm, vibrating through the air like a pulse. That night, the dream returned with a vengeance. I was no longer standing in the void. I was being pulled toward the figure, its eyes burning with a terrifying intensity. I felt my consciousness unraveling, the edges of my reality fraying as I was drawn closer. I woke up screaming, but the sound of my voice was drowned out by the static on the radio, a reminder of the presence that had infiltrated my life. With each passing day, I sank deeper into a pit of anxiety and dread. The recordings became an obsession I could not escape, each listen revealing more layers of the mystery that had consumed me. It was as if the very essence of the radio was awakening, feeding off my fear, drawing me closer to a truth I couldn't comprehend. Then came the night I'll never forget. Lying in bed, my heart raced as the radio erupted into chaos, the beeping reaching a deafening crescendo. The lights in my house flickered violently, and I could hear the whispers merging into a cacophony of sounds that twisted through the air. Panic surged as I realized I wasn't alone. Glimpsing out my window, I saw them. Figures standing in my yard, tall and unnaturally thin, their eyes glowing with an unsettling light. They moved in unison, their bodies swaying rhythmically to the frantic beeping of my radio. Terror rooted me in place as I watched them, the whispers wrapping around my mind like a vice, drowning out my thoughts. The last thing I remember is the static rising to a deafening roar, drowning out everything else. Then, silence. I woke up in my bed, the radio silent, the figures gone, but the sensation of their presence still lingered like a chilling echo in the depths of my mind. Days turned into weeks, and I couldn't shake the feeling that they were still watching. Late at night, I would lie in bed, feeling the weight of unseen eyes pressing against the walls of my home. The signal had faded, but its effects remained, a reminder of the connection I had forged with something beyond comprehension. Now I can't bring myself to touch the radio. I sometimes hear faint beeping in the distance, echoing through the quiet. I know they're still out there, waiting for my response, and I fear the day they decide to reach out to me once more. Growing up in a rural town, I was accustomed to the vastness of the fields that surrounded us. The cornfields stretched for miles, golden stalks swaying gently in the breeze, inviting curiosity and adventure. However, one summer a palpable change swept over the landscape. It began with strange lights flickering in the night sky, vibrant colors dancing like fireflies but never fading. They were mesmerizing, and despite the unsettling sense that accompanied them, I couldn't resist their allure. As the days turned into weeks, my friends and I gathered on the roof to watch the lights. Each night they flickered in patterns, seemingly communicating, yet we could never decipher their message. The once familiar fields now felt foreign, imbued with an eerie energy that hung in the air. The lights grew brighter and more erratic, casting an otherworldly glow over the landscape, transforming the cornfield into a realm that felt alive, almost sentient. Driven by a mix of curiosity and reckless bravery, I decided to venture into the cornfield one evening. An unshakable urge propelled me forward, despite the darkening sky. I walked deeper into the rows of corn, the towering stalks surrounding me, rustling softly as if whispering secrets that were just out of reach. The world outside faded, swallowed by the swaying sea of green and gold. Suddenly, the lights exploded into a dazzling array, illuminating the field in blinding brilliance. I shielded my eyes, feeling the warmth wash over me. However, as I opened them again, a chilling realization dawned. An unsettling stillness enveloped the landscape, replacing the comforting sounds of crickets and rustling leaves with an oppressive quiet that made my skin prickle. Shadows began to emerge at the periphery of the light, shifting and coiling in unnatural patterns, their shapes becoming more defined as they drew closer. In the heart of the cornfield, the lights converged, forming a pulsating orb that hovered just above the ground. My heart raced, a primal instinct urging me to flee. I stood frozen in place, unable to comprehend the scene unfolding before me. The shadows elongated, twisting and morphing into figures that were tall and impossibly thin. Their skin glistened in the light, reflecting the colors of the orb like a prism. There was an unsettling harmony in their appearance, an elegance that felt out of place amidst the chaos of the cornfield. As the orb pulsed, I felt an overwhelming pull toward the figures, as if an invisible thread connected us. The energy surged around me, a force both intoxicating and terrifying. I took a step back, but the figures extended their arms, beckoning with an invitation I couldn't quite understand. An instinctual dread bubbled within me, yet the curiosity clawed at my resolve, tempting me to move closer. Suddenly, a wave of energy cascaded through the field. The figures began to glide toward me, their forms shifting and flowing like liquid shadows. I could feel the hum of their presence reverberating through the ground, vibrating in my bones. As they drew nearer, a primal sense of fear washed over me, urging me to escape. The pull intensified, making my heartbeat race as I fought against the urge to advance. In a desperate bid to break free, I turned and bolted toward the tree line, heart pounding in my chest. The corn seemed to close in around me, the stalks whispering like 1,000 voices urging me to stay. I stumbled, tearing through the rows of corn, desperate to escape the energy that thrummed in the air. Finally, I reached the edge of the field and burst into the safety of the trees. I leaned against the rough bark, gasping for air, heart racing as I glanced back. The lights dimmed slightly, but the figures remained, their glowing eyes locked onto mine, unblinking and unfathomable. They lingered at the threshold of the field, watching me with an intensity that made my blood run cold. In that moment I understood. The lights, the figures, the harvest, it was all a part of something much larger than myself. The fields had transformed into a hunting ground, a place where they gathered, and I had unwittingly trespassed into their realm. The energy of the night pulsed with their hunger, an insatiable need that felt like a dark promise of something far more sinister. As I stumbled away from the field, the lights flickered once more, casting eerie shadows on the ground. The weight of their gaze followed me, a chilling reminder of the encounter that would haunt my dreams. I never returned to the cornfield, but the memory of that night stayed etched in my mind. Weeks turned into months, and the lights eventually faded from the sky, yet I remained haunted by their presence. Occasionally, late at night, I would hear whispers in the wind rustling through the trees, and I would feel their eyes upon me, waiting and watching from the depths of the cornfield. The harvest was not just a physical act, it was a reminder of the connection forged that night, a bond that could never be broken. I realized that the cycle of their harvest would continue, and I could not escape the unsettling truth that whatever had claimed that cornfield was still out there, lurking in the shadows, ready to reach out when the time was right. It started as nothing more than a strange light in the distance. I'd see it hovering over the cornfield at night, flickering softly, like a lantern held by an unseen hand. Living in the countryside, you get used to weird sights, flashes of headlights, passing drones, even the occasional lightning bug. But this was different. The light would linger, pulsing with an unsteady rhythm, before disappearing behind the tall stalks. I tried to ignore it. Nights are long out here, and your mind plays tricks when there's nothing but the rustle of wind through the corn to keep you company. But last week, things escalated. I was coming back from town, my headlights cutting through the darkness when I saw them. Two glowing eyes deep within the cornfield staring back at me. They didn't blink, didn't shift, just watched as I slowed the car to a stop. For a long moment I stared back, convinced I was imagining things. But the eyes remained, bright and unyielding, locked onto mine. As the days passed, I started noticing changes around the house. In the mornings, I'd find patches of flattened corn, as if something enormous had moved through the field overnight. My dog, usually eager to explore, now refused to go near the rows. He'd whimper and scratch at the door if I tried to coax him out after dark. Even the birds had stopped singing in the mornings, leaving the land unnervingly silent. One night, I decided to stay up, hoping to catch another glimpse of whatever was out there. I took a chair and sat by the window, watching the field bathed in the moon's pale light. Hours passed, my eyes growing heavy, until I saw it again, the faint glow weaving through the stalks, drawing closer. This time I saw more than just the eyes. A shape loomed behind them, impossibly tall, moving with a fluid, unsettling grace. It was hard to make out details. The corn obscured most of it, but there was something unmistakably wrong about its proportions. Every night since, those eyes have appeared closer to the house. At first, they'd stay near the edge of the field, barely visible through the leaves, but now, they linger just beyond my porch. I've stopped sitting by the window. Instead, I keep the blinds drawn, pretending I'm not aware of their presence, hoping that ignoring them will make them disappear. Last night, I woke to a soft scratching at the back door. My heart pounded as I lay there, listening to the sound grow more insistent, as if it knew I was awake. There's dirt tracked across my doorstep now, strange prints embedded in the soil. Whatever's out there, it's no longer content with the field, it's looking for a way in. After my grandfather passed, I spent days sorting through the clutter he'd collected over the years. Among all the tools and mementos, his ham radio stood out, dusty but still functional. I kept it more out of nostalgia than anything else, remembering the times he'd let me listen in on late-night broadcasts as a kid. He'd always claimed that you could hear things on it you couldn't find anywhere else, that the airwaves carried secrets if you knew how to listen. One night, curiosity led me to switch it on. The static crackled through the room, rising and falling, as if teasing the idea of something just out of reach. I adjusted the dials, tuning through the empty frequencies when I stumbled upon a signal. At first, it was faint, almost lost in the static, but there was a distinct, urgent quality to it, like someone trying to break through a barrier. The whispers started soon after. At first, it was just garbled nonsense, words twisted beyond recognition. But as I continued to listen, they grew clearer, more focused, as if they'd latched onto my frequency and were beginning to find their voice. It was unmistakably human, but wrong in some subtle, unsettling way, like the speaker was mimicking what they thought a voice should sound like. I tried ignoring it, chalking it up to interference or some prank from a nearby radio operator, but no matter how I adjusted the dials, the whispers followed like they were tethered to my station. The more I listened, the more I began to discern. Fragments of words, phrases that hinted at desperation and fear, threaded through the static. Then, one night, something changed. The whispers became more direct, more urgent, almost frantic, and that's when I realized they were saying my name. I turned off the radio, the room plunging into silence, but I could still hear it, faint but unmistakable, like an echo lodged in the back of my mind. The following day I noticed the scratches, tiny, jagged lines etched into the wall behind the radio as if someone had been trying to claw their way through. They weren't there before. As the nights passed, the radio would turn itself on. I'd wake up to that familiar crackle, the whispers louder, more insistent. I unplugged it, but the static continued, a faint buzz in the corners of the room as though the walls themselves were humming. I covered the radio with a blanket, hoping to muffle the noise, but it made no difference. The whispers seeped through, weaving into my thoughts, growing more demanding, more focused. I decided to disconnect it entirely, pulling the wires from the back, determined to silence it for good. That's when I noticed the scorch marks. The wires had fused together, blackened as if something had surged through them. My fingers burned when I touched them, but I couldn't bring myself to let go. It felt like something was holding me there, like the radio was feeding off my touch. I've since locked the radio in the garage, buried under piles of boxes and blankets. But every night the static returns, louder, vibrating through the floorboards, and those whispers follow, closer than ever. I don't turn on any other radios, afraid that they'll start whispering too, afraid that they'll tell me what's coming. Yesterday, I noticed the scratches had spread to the front door. The highway stretched endlessly before me, a narrow ribbon of asphalt cutting through the darkness. It was the kind of road that felt deserted even in the middle of the day, and at night it became something else entirely, a void, swallowing everything beyond the reach of the headlights. I'd driven this stretch 100 times before, always on my way back from late shifts at work, and nothing unusual had ever happened. Until that night. I was halfway home when I saw it, standing dead center in the road. At first, it was just a shape in the distance, a shadow darker than the surrounding black, and I figured it was a trick of the light. As I got closer, I realized this was no illusion. It was a figure, impossibly tall and thin, with limbs that seemed unnaturally elongated. I felt an instinctive urge to keep driving, to let the car's momentum carry me past, but something kept my foot on the brake. The car slowed to a crawl, and my eyes locked onto the figure. There were no features, no discernible details, just a form that seemed to absorb every bit of light that touched it. It stood there, unyielding, as if waiting for something. I felt a cold sweat break across my skin, and for the first time in years, I felt genuinely trapped, even with nothing but open road around me. When I glanced at the rearview mirror, my heart skipped a beat. It was there again, this time directly behind the car. I hadn't seen it move. One moment, the road was empty, and the next, it was there, fingers tapping lightly against the trunk. I pressed harder on the gas, and the car shot forward, the engine protesting as I sped away. But no matter how fast I went, that shadow stayed with me, flickering in and out of my peripheral vision like some broken projection. The highway seemed endless, stretching further than it ever had before. The light from my high beams barely seemed to penetrate the darkness, only illuminating the road immediately in front of me. And in that narrow beam, I could see faint impressions, footprints, long and deep, trailing alongside the car. I refused to look in the mirrors again, refused to let my eyes drift from the road, but I could sense it, pacing the car, keeping time with my panicked acceleration. Finally, I saw the glow of a gas station up ahead, its neon lights flickering against the night. I pulled in, tires screeching against the pavement, and jumped out, desperate for any sense of normalcy. I stumbled inside, panting, and stood there in the fluorescent lighting, trying to catch my breath. The cashier didn't look up, didn't acknowledge my presence, just continued flipping through a magazine as if nothing was wrong. I looked back through the glass doors, half expecting to see the shadow waiting for me, but the highway was empty. I felt a brief moment of relief, but as I turned back toward my car, something caught my eye. Faint, almost imperceptible. A series of handprints covered the windows, long and thin, stretching from the back bumper to the driver's side door. I couldn't bring myself to wipe them off. Even now, weeks later, they remain etched into the glass, smeared but visible, like a lingering reminder that something had been there. Every time I drive that stretch of highway, I catch glimpses of it out of the corner of my eye. A flicker of movement, a shadow stretching out just beyond the headlights, always waiting, always just out of reach. And every night I drive a little faster, knowing that one day it might catch up. When I moved into the apartment, I didn't think much about the landlord's casual warning about the basement. He described it as an old, damp space, prone to creaks and odd noises, mostly from the aging pipes and boiler. The door, he said, had a tendency to stick, but it was nothing to worry about. It sounded like the kind of issues you'd expect from an old building, and I dismissed it as such. The first few weeks were uneventful, but then the noises began. Faint at first, just a dull scraping sound that came from the basement door late at night. I convinced myself it was the building settling, perhaps a mouse or rat scurrying through the walls. But then, one night, I heard something distinctly different. It was a sound like nails, dragging slowly across wood, coming from just beyond the basement door. The noise wasn't frantic, nor was it soft. It was deliberate, almost as if something was testing the boundary between its world and mine. Curiosity and unease drove me to inspect the door. I pushed against it, and sure enough, it was stuck. After a few tries, it finally gave way with a groan, revealing a set of deep, jagged marks gouged into the wood from the other side. They looked fresh, the wood splintered and raw, as if something with claws had been trying to scratch its way through. I stood there, staring into the darkness of the basement. The light switch was on the far wall, but no amount of bravery would make me take that step. The air coming from below was stale, carrying a faint, earthy scent like soil left untouched for too long. I quickly closed the door, wedging a chair under the handle as an extra barrier just in case. After that night, the noises grew more insistent. I'd lie awake listening to the rhythmic scraping, now accompanied by a faint shuffling sound, as though something was dragging itself across the floor. It moved in patterns, pacing back and forth, as if trapped and searching for a way out. One morning I noticed the wallpaper around the basement door had begun to peel, curling back in thin strips, revealing a dark stain that spread outward inch by inch. I started avoiding the living room altogether, spending more time in my bedroom as far from the basement door as possible. But it didn't matter, the noises followed. I could hear them in the vents, faint whispers of scratching and shifting, as if the creature was learning the layout of the apartment, testing the boundaries that kept us apart. One evening I returned from work to find the chair I'd wedged under the door handle pushed aside. The basement door was slightly ajar, no more than a crack, but enough to let a draft of cold air seep into the hallway. My heart raced as I approached, the sense that something had been there, something that had tried to push its way through. I braced myself and pulled the door shut once more, wedging a heavy stack of books against it this time. As I did, I noticed something glinting in the dim light, a thin silvery thread dangling from the doorframe, swaying slightly. I reached out to touch it, and it broke apart, crumbling into dust between my fingers. It was hair, coarse and brittle, like the remains of something long buried. Since that night, I've been finding more of those hairs around the apartment, tangled in the corners of the room, caught in the vents, even pressed against the windows as if something had brushed against the glass from the outside. They seem to be multiplying, each one a silent reminder that the creature hasn't given up, that it's still searching for a way through. I've stopped using the living room altogether. The basement door remains shut, buried under a makeshift barricade of anything heavy enough to keep it in place. But the noises haven't stopped. If anything, they've grown louder. And now, at night, I hear something else. A soft, wet, dragging sound, like nails raking across the floorboards, moving ever closer. I dread the moment when that door finally gives way, when whatever's lurking behind it decides it's had enough of waiting. The forest behind my house has always been unnerving. Its trees grow taller than they should, twisted in odd, unnatural angles, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. Despite living here for years, I'd never ventured far into it. There were no animal tracks, no signs of life, just a pervasive stillness that hung over the woods like a shroud. But that changed the night I saw the glow. It was faint at first, barely visible through the thick brush, a soft green light that pulsed with an unsteady rhythm. I thought it was a trick of the moonlight or maybe the reflection of a distant house, but it didn't fade. If anything, it grew brighter, more insistent, as if beckoning me forward. Against my better judgment, I grabbed a flashlight and made my way through the underbrush, branches snagging my clothes, the silence of the forest pressing in on all sides. The deeper I ventured, the brighter the light became. It seemed to shimmer from below the earth, illuminating the roots and fallen leaves, casting eerie shadows that shifted with every step. I reached a small clearing, where the light was strongest, and that's when I saw it. A perfectly round hole, about 3 feet wide, with that unsettling green glow emanating from its depths. The hole looked unnatural, the edges smoothed as if by some unseen hand, and inside something moved. At first, it was just a flicker, like a ripple across water. But then it emerged, scales reflecting the glow, catching the light as it slithered forward. It was hard to tell where the creature began and the shadows ended. Its limbs were long and jagged, tipped with sharp, blackened claws that scraped against the earth as it pulled itself forward. I took a step back, and that's when it turned its head toward me. Its eyes weren't like anything I'd seen before, not quite eyes at all, more like polished stones that gleamed with the same green light, blinking in unison with the pulse from the hole. It regarded me for a long moment, unblinking, before it sank back into the darkness, disappearing into the earth as if it had never been there. I stumbled back through the woods, the glow fading behind me, but something had changed. The silence was gone. In its place was a low, almost imperceptible hum, reverberating through the ground as if the forest itself was vibrating with some hidden energy. I locked the doors when I got home, every instinct telling me to forget what I'd seen, to pretend that the clearing didn't exist. But that night, as I lay in bed, I saw the light again, faint but visible, glowing from beneath the floorboards. The next morning I found fresh dirt tracked across my living room, small clumps that led from the back door to the center of the room. There on the wooden floor was another mark, a perfectly round impression, no larger than a dinner plate. With that same smooth, unnatural edge, I swept up the dirt, telling myself it was just mud I'd brought in from the night before. But deep down I knew that wasn't true. Since that night, the glow has begun to spread. At first, it was just a faint glimmer along the edges of my yard, but now it pulses beneath the grass, creeping closer to the house. I can feel it, humming beneath my feet, like the roots themselves are growing restless. More holes have started appearing, small at first, but widening with each passing day, their edges smooth and wet, as if something is tunneling up from below. Last night I woke to the sound of scratching, faint but persistent, coming from the walls. I thought I saw a flicker of green light beneath the baseboards, shifting and moving as if searching for a way in. I tried to ignore it, but when I looked outside, I saw dozens of glowing eyes staring back at me from the edge of the forest, unblinking and patient, waiting for the moment when the light finally breaks through. The figure by the window began as an unsettling curiosity, something that lingered at the edge of my awareness. At first, I told myself it was simply a trick of the fog, an illusion caused by the dim streetlight filtering through the haze. But as the nights wore on, that illusion solidified into something much more sinister. Each evening, I would settle into my armchair, the glow of the television flickering against the walls. The room would fill with warmth, wrapping me in a cocoon of comfort. But the moment I glanced toward the window, my heart would drop. The figure was always there, standing just beyond the glass, an indistinct shape against the murky backdrop of mist. It never moved, merely loomed, shrouded in darkness. The outline was tall and thin, so tall it seemed to stretch upward, disappearing into the haze above. As the nights passed, its presence felt more pronounced, more urgent, as if it were drawing power from the shadows. I began to notice details. The edges of its form were sharp, and though there were no features to distinguish it, I could feel its gaze penetrating the very fabric of my being, studying me with an intensity that was unsettling. When the weather turned colder, the glass would frost over, creating an opaque barrier between us. I found myself drawn to the window, compelled to press my forehead against the chill of the glass, hoping to glimpse what lay beyond. But the figure remained impenetrable, a dark silhouette etched against the swirling fog, never shifting from its spot. Days turned into weeks, and the figure became a constant in my life. It invaded my thoughts, creeping into my dreams as I lay in bed at night. I could feel its presence in the silence, an energy that thrummed in the back of my mind. It wasn't just standing anymore. It felt as though it was reaching out, extending its essence through the glass, trying to bridge the gap between our worlds. One stormy night, the wind howled outside, rattling the windows as rain poured down in sheets. The lights flickered, casting erratic shadows across the room. That's when I saw it more clearly, illuminated by flashes of lightning. The figure appeared even closer, its silhouette sharp and distinct against the flashes of light. Each flash revealed hints of form that had previously eluded me: elongated limbs, a torso that seemed to twist unnaturally, and what appeared to be a tattered cloak that hung around its body, blending into the darkness. I backed away, heart racing, instinctively feeling that the space between us was no longer just a barrier of glass. I grasped the edge of my chair, fighting the impulse to look away. I felt trapped, as if the room itself was shrinking, the walls closing in around me. My breath quickened as I turned to escape into the safety of the other room, but I could not help but glance back one last time. In that fleeting moment, I caught a glimpse of something that chilled me to the bone. The figure seemed to smile, though its features were indistinguishable. It was a wicked grin, one that spread across the darkness, revealing nothing more than a void where its mouth should have been. The lights flickered once more, and in that instant of darkness, I felt an icy rush of dread wash over me. The following days were consumed by a persistent unease. I avoided the window, drawing the curtains tight, but it didn't help. I could feel it outside, an ever-watchful presence lurking just beyond my vision, a weight that pressed against the glass as if it were trying to seep into my home. Then one morning I awoke to find a set of long, thin fingerprints pressed against the window, trailing down as though something had been watching me while I slept. They were smudged, the edges blurred as if the figure had tried to reach through the glass. I stood frozen, staring at the marks, the realization settling in. It was only a matter of time before it would find a way in. I barricaded the window with furniture, a desperate attempt to reclaim my sense of safety. Yet even as I did, the figure remained just beyond the glass, its dark outline persistent, a promise that it wouldn't leave me alone. Each night I could hear the faint scratching against the window like nails raking against the surface, the sound haunting and relentless. Sleep became a fleeting memory, haunted by the presence just outside. I could no longer differentiate between reality and the waking nightmares that plagued me. One night, I gathered the courage to confront the figure. I peeled back the curtain, expecting to face whatever horror awaited me. But as the fabric fell away, the window was empty. For a fleeting moment, relief washed over me. But then, as I stepped back, a cold rush enveloped me, and I felt a breath against my neck, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. The figure may have been gone, but I knew it hadn't left. It was merely waiting for the right moment to return. I could feel its presence wrapping around the house, a shadow that refused to fade, whispering promises of what lay just beyond the glass. The pond had always been a serene refuge, a hidden gem in the woods that whispered of tranquility. Its surface glimmered under the sun, reflecting the trees that surrounded it, the light dancing on the water like a gentle embrace. Yet, as I approached that morning, an inexplicable unease settled in my gut. The usual stillness felt tainted, as if something stirred beneath the surface, waiting. As I neared the edge, I noticed the water rippling slightly, the reflection of the sky fractured in a way that felt wrong. It wasn't a breeze. It was as if the pond itself was breathing, inhaling and exhaling, the surface shifting in unnatural rhythms. I knelt down, peering closer, hoping to catch a glimpse of the fish I often spotted darting beneath the surface. But today, the water was empty, void of life, as if some unseen force had drained it of all its inhabitants. Then I saw it, a flicker of movement just below the surface. At first it was indistinct, but slowly it took form. An outline emerged, and I leaned in closer, squinting to make sense of what lay beneath. The figure appeared human, yet there was something distinctly wrong. Its limbs elongated, its body distorted, twisted in a way that defied the natural order. I felt a chill creep up my spine as I realized it was staring back at me, its gaze penetrating, glinting with a reflective light that pulsed like a heartbeat. The moment I blinked, the figure vanished, swallowed by the depths. My heart raced and I pulled back, shaking my head to dispel the lingering vision. Perhaps I had imagined it, a figment conjured by the early morning light. Yet the air felt charged, buzzing with anticipation, as if the pond itself were a living entity, aware of my presence. Days passed and the pond's eerie pull was undeniable. I returned, driven by a mixture of fear and fascination. Each time the surface would ripple as I approached, a silent invitation that was hard to resist. The figure would flicker at the edge of my vision, always just below the water, a ghostly shape that taunted me from the depths. My heart raced as I knelt beside it, eyes scanning the surface for any sign of the distortion that had haunted my thoughts. Then, one evening, the sun began to set, casting a golden hue across the pond. I could feel the air around me shift, the coolness creeping in as the light faded. I took a deep breath and leaned closer, my heartbeat echoing in the silence. The water, usually so calm, began to swirl, churning as if disturbed by some unseen force. In that moment, the figure broke the surface, its shape emerging fully, grotesque yet captivating. It was humanoid, but its skin shimmered like the surface of the water, refracting light in a way that made it difficult to focus on. Its features remained vague, a blur of color and shadow, but I could sense its eyes locking onto mine, filled with a longing that was both unsettling and intriguing. It twisted and turned, the reflection distorting with every movement, the water splashing against the edges of the pond as if it were alive, reacting to its presence. I stumbled back, nearly losing my footing on the bank. In a moment of panic, I turned to run, but a strong urge pulled me back. I needed to understand. Each time I resisted, the figure became more vivid in my mind, its presence an undeniable reality that pulled me closer. I stepped forward, heart pounding, drawn in by a force I couldn't explain. As I reached the water's edge, the pond became a mirror and I saw my reflection for the first time. But it was not just my face staring back. The figure hovered just below the surface, reaching out as if to bridge the gap between our worlds. The connection felt tangible, a thread weaving between us. I stretched my hand out toward it, fingers grazing the surface of the water, and in that instant everything shifted. A surge of energy coursed through me, pulling me closer to the pond. I felt weightless, as if the water were inviting me to plunge into its depths. The figure seemed to beckon, its form morphing and swirling, a dance of light and shadow. I could see now that it was not just a reflection, it was an embodiment of something deeper, a creature born of the pond itself. The moment my fingers broke the surface, everything changed. A wave of cold washed over me and the world around me faded. I was submerged in darkness, the water enveloping me like a shroud. I struggled to find the surface, but the figure was there, wrapping around me, guiding me deeper into the pond's embrace. Just as panic set in, I felt a sudden rush, as if the figure had transformed from a haunting specter into a lifeline. It held me steady, and in that moment, clarity surged through my mind. I understood the connection between us, the purpose of its presence. I was not merely a spectator, I was part of the cycle, drawn into the depths of the unknown. Then, just as quickly, everything changed. I broke through the surface, gasping for air, the moonlight illuminating the pond once more. I lay on the bank, trembling, heart racing, as I glanced back at the water. The figure was gone, but the surface shimmered, rippling softly in the night breeze. Though the pond had returned to its calm state, I knew that something had shifted within me. I could feel the creature beneath, a part of me now, a connection that ran deeper than I could comprehend. As I left the pond that night, I glanced over my shoulder one last time, aware that I had crossed a threshold forever entwined with the mysteries that lay beneath the water's surface. It began with a light bulb flicker, a subtle sign that something was awry. One evening, while immersed in the glow of the television, the lamp beside me sputtered for just a moment. I brushed it off, thinking it was a mere electrical glitch. But the flickering became a nightly ritual, an unsettling prelude to the darkness that lingered in the corners of my home. Each evening, as I settled into my armchair, I would notice the light dimming, a soft stutter before plunging back into brightness. It felt as though the house was breathing, the light pulsing in sync with some hidden rhythm. I dismissed it, attributing the disturbances to the aging wiring, but a nagging feeling began to creep in, whispering that something was off. As the flickering persisted, so too did the shadow in the corner of the room. At first, it was a mere absence of light, a deepening of the darkness that clung to the walls, but gradually it became something more tangible, an entity that seemed to grow with the flickering lights. It was as if the shadows themselves were taking shape, coalescing into a figure that hovered just beyond my vision. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself it was just my imagination. Yet every time the lights flickered, the shadow seemed to inch closer, drawn by the pulsating glow. I began to feel trapped within the confines of my own home, the walls closing in around me as I succumbed to the claustrophobic grip of fear. One night, the lights went out completely, plunging the room into a void. I reached for my phone, desperate for any source of illumination, and when the screen flickered to life, I saw it, standing inches away, an elongated form shrouded in darkness, its presence palpable. My heart raced as I realized the shadow was no longer just an absence. It had solidified into something sinister. As I backed away, the lights flickered back on and the figure vanished. I found myself staring at the empty corner, a sense of dread washing over me. I shook my head, trying to rationalize what I had seen. Perhaps it was just a trick of the light, a fleeting image conjured by my mind. But the scratching began soon after, faint at first but growing louder with each passing night. The sounds echoed through the silence of my home, an insistent scratching like nails raking against the wooden floor. It came from the walls, the ceiling, everywhere, a dissonant symphony that filled the space around me. I could feel the figure lingering just outside my line of sight, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the next flicker of light to draw it closer. Desperate for answers, I began researching the history of the house, unearthing stories of previous occupants who had experienced similar disturbances. There were whispers of spirits, entities that clung to the walls, feeding on fear and darkness. I felt a chill settle over me as I read, realizing I was not alone in this battle against the shadows. As the days turned into weeks, I grew increasingly paranoid, convinced that the figure was watching me, waiting for the moment I would succumb to its presence. I covered every window, barricaded the doors, and sealed the cracks, desperate to keep the darkness at bay. But still I could feel it, a pulse beneath the surface, lurking just out of reach. Then, one stormy night, the winds howled outside, rattling the windows, and the lights flickered more violently than ever. My heart pounded in rhythm with the flickers, a chaotic dance of light and shadow. I sat in the center of the room, frozen, the darkness pressing against the edges of my vision. With each flash of lightning, the figure reappeared, closer than before, its form sharpening in the brief moments of illumination. It stood at the threshold of my perception, a mass of shifting shadows, its eyes glinting like cold embers, locking onto mine with an intensity that sent shivers down my spine. In that moment of panic, I felt an overwhelming urge to escape. I grabbed my coat and bolted for the door, ready to leave the house behind. But as I reached for the handle, the lights flickered one last time, plunging me into darkness. I felt a hand, cool and unyielding, grasp my shoulder, pulling me back into the void. The next thing I remember is awakening in the center of the room, surrounded by darkness, the oppressive weight of the shadow pressing in from all sides. The scratching had intensified, an angry symphony echoing through the walls, as if the house itself were alive, rebelling against my presence. I fought against the rising tide of despair, my heart racing as I searched for a way out. Then, in a moment of clarity, I recalled the stories of others who had faced the darkness. I remembered their strength, their refusal to succumb. I rose to my feet, the flickering lights casting fleeting shadows across the room. With each flicker, I felt the figure retreat slightly, as if the light was pushing it back, but it would not let me go easily. I summoned all the courage I had left, standing firm against the encroaching darkness, embracing the flickers of light that illuminated the room. As the final flicker of light filled the space, I realized that I had the power to confront it, to reclaim my home from its grasp. With a deep breath, I turned toward the shadows, forcing myself to meet its gaze. I stood my ground, allowing the light to seep into every corner of the room, illuminating the dark recesses where the figure had hidden. In that moment of defiance, the scratching ceased, replaced by an eerie silence. The figure lingered for a heartbeat longer, then dissipated, retreating into the depths of the darkness. I felt a wave of relief wash over me, the oppressive weight lifting from my shoulders as the light steadied. Though I had faced the figure, I knew that the darkness would always be a part of my home, an echo of what had come before. Yet, I felt empowered, a newfound strength coursing through me. The flickering lights were no longer a harbinger of dread. They became a reminder of my resilience, a testament to the battle I had fought and won. As I turned off the television and settled into my armchair, I glanced toward the corner where the shadows had once loomed. The space felt different now, lighter, and I could sense that the figure had retreated, at least for the time being. I knew I would remain vigilant, ready to face whatever lingered in the darkness. But for now, I found solace in the steady glow of the light, a beacon of hope against the shadows that threatened to overwhelm. The old house sat on the outskirts of town, a forgotten relic of a bygone era. Its peeling paint and sagging porch spoke of neglect, while the overgrown weeds wrapped around the structure like the tendrils of a long-forgotten secret. I had stumbled upon it during a hike through the woods, curiosity piquing as I noticed its silhouette framed against the dimming sky. The sun was setting, casting an orange hue across the horizon, and the shadows from the trees reached out toward the house, creating an eerie contrast. Drawn by a strange compulsion, I stepped closer, the crunch of leaves beneath my feet the only sound breaking the silence. As I approached the weathered door, I felt a shiver run down my spine, an instinctive warning that something was amiss. Yet the pull was irresistible, urging me to push the door open and step inside. The hinges creaked ominously as I entered, revealing a dark hallway that stretched before me. Dust motes danced in the last light of day, swirling in the air like restless spirits. My heart raced, but curiosity pushed me deeper into the shadows. The scent of damp wood and mold greeted me, mingling with the remnants of something sweet and decayed. I moved cautiously, the floorboards groaning under my weight. Each step echoed in the silence, amplifying the tension that hung in the air. The walls were adorned with faded photographs, their subjects obscured by time, yet the eyes in the images seemed to follow me, watching with an intensity that sent chills coursing through me. I felt a chill creep over my skin, the kind that settles in your bones, whispering that I was not alone. As I ventured further, I came upon an old parlor. The furniture lay draped in dust covers, like ghosts lingering in the twilight. A fireplace dominated one wall, its mantel lined with trinkets, each a fragment of a life once lived. I couldn't shake the feeling that the room was holding its breath, waiting for something to unfold. Then I noticed it, a faint glow emanating from a door at the far end of the room. It flickered like a candle flame, beckoning me closer. My heart raced as I stepped toward it, the warmth drawing me in despite the gnawing unease. As I approached the door, the light seemed to pulse, casting strange shadows that danced across the walls. I hesitated, a part of me screaming to turn back, but the glow was irresistible. I reached for the handle, its cold metal sending a jolt through my arm, and pushed the door open. A rush of warmth enveloped me, contrasting sharply with the chill of the hallway. Inside was a small room, cluttered with oddities. Glass jars filled with strange liquids lined the shelves, their contents swirling in vibrant colors. In the center stood a table covered with handwritten notes and curious trinkets, remnants of experiments long abandoned. Yet it was the light that captivated me, a strange orb floating just above the table, glowing with an otherworldly luminescence. As I stepped closer, the orb flickered in response, illuminating the room in hues of blue and green. It felt alive, vibrating with energy that seemed to resonate with my very being. I reached out, entranced by its brilliance, but just as my fingers brushed its surface, the room plunged into darkness. The orb vanished, leaving me enveloped in a suffocating void. Panic surged through me as I fumbled for the door, heart pounding in my chest. But the darkness pressed in, thick and heavy, wrapping around me like a shroud. I stumbled backward, my breath quickening as I searched for the light, desperate for an escape. Suddenly the air shifted, a low hum vibrating through the space. It was as if the very walls were alive, resonating with the energy that had been unleashed. I felt a presence behind me, a weight in the shadows, watching with a hunger that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I turned, my heart racing as I peered into the inky blackness. The glow returned, flickering like a dying star, illuminating a figure standing just beyond my reach. It was vague, an outline obscured by shadows, but I could feel its gaze, piercing through the darkness, locking onto me with an intensity that sent chills down my spine. The figure shifted, and I felt the air around me crackle with energy, the ground vibrating beneath my feet. Fear coursed through my veins as I realized I was no longer in control. The orb pulsed with a rhythm that matched the beating of my heart, and the figure seemed to draw strength from it, growing more distinct with each thrum. As the light flickered again, I caught a glimpse of its face, an amalgamation of shadows and light shifting and morphing like smoke. Its eyes were hollow, voids that reflected my own terror, and I felt an overwhelming urge to flee. but the figure reached out, its hand stretching toward me, and I was paralyzed, caught in the grip of a force beyond my understanding. In that moment, I understood. It was not just an entity, but a manifestation of the house itself, a guardian of secrets long forgotten. The orb flickered one last time, and with a rush of energy it surged toward me, engulfing the darkness and illuminating every corner of the room. I felt a wave of clarity wash over me, an understanding that transcended fear. With newfound resolve, I stepped forward, breaking the paralysis that had gripped me. I reached for the orb, and as my fingers made contact, a jolt of energy coursed through me. The figure vanished, the darkness dissipating like mist under the sun. The room was transformed, bathed in light, revealing its true nature, an alchemist's sanctuary, filled with knowledge waiting to be discovered. The air felt lighter, the oppressive weight lifted as the secrets of the house unfolded before me. As I turned to leave, I took one last look back at the orb, now a steady glow in the center of the room. I understood that the house was a repository of ancient wisdom, a reminder of the power that lay within the shadows. I stepped out into the fading light of day, knowing that I had forged a connection with the mysteries of the past, a guardian of secrets that would guide me in the days to come. The abandoned fairground lay dormant, a remnant of joy that had long since faded. Rusting rides stood sentinel, under a canopy of trees, their once bright colors now muted by years of neglect. I had wandered into this forgotten place on a whim, drawn by the whisper of memories echoing through the remnants of laughter and light. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows that stretched like fingers across the cracked pavement. As I walked along the path, the sound of my footsteps echoed in the eerie stillness. The Ferris wheel loomed ahead, its towering structure a skeletal frame against the sky. I approached, feeling a chill crawl up my spine. The seats swayed slightly in the breeze, a ghostly reminder of the thrill they once offered. A strange sensation prickled at the back of my mind, an awareness that something was watching me from the depths of the fairground. The scent of popcorn lingered in the air, a bittersweet reminder of happier days. But it felt tainted, as if nostalgia had curdled into something unsettling. I continued my exploration, drawn toward the funhouse at the far end of the grounds. The facade was warped, with mirrors reflecting distorted images of reality. I stepped inside, the creaking door groaning in protest. The interior was a labyrinth of twisted corridors, the air thick with the scent of mildew and decay. As I ventured deeper, the mirrors warped my reflection, multiplying it into countless versions of myself, each more grotesque than the last. The laughter of children seemed to echo faintly, fading in and out, an auditory illusion that sent shivers through me. I felt the sensation of being followed, a lingering presence at my back that sent my heart racing. Turning a corner, I found myself in a dimly lit room filled with old carnival games. Dust-covered prizes lined the shelves, their once cheerful colors now dull and lifeless. In the center of the room stood a game booth, its sign reading, "Ring Toss." The rings lay scattered on the counter, untouched for years. A chill ran down my spine as I noticed a single ring still hanging on the post, swaying slightly as if it had just been tossed. I stepped closer, compelled by an inexplicable urge to play. My fingers grazed the rough surface of the counter, and the moment I touched it, a rush of energy coursed through me. The air vibrated, as if the very essence of the fairground was awakening, and I could feel the thrill of the past surfacing around me. The laughter grew louder, filling the room with an unsettling mirth that sent tingles of dread racing down my spine. Suddenly, the lights flickered, casting the room into shadows. The mirrors warped, reflecting distorted faces that seemed to press against the glass, their eyes filled with longing. I stumbled back, heart racing as I turned to escape, but the path I had taken was no longer visible. The funhouse had transformed, the corridors shifting like a living maze. A low hum resonated through the walls, a rhythmic pulse that synced with my heartbeat. I sprinted down one passage, the walls closing in around me, and then turned sharply into another. The mirrors multiplied my image, creating an unsettling panorama of distorted reflections that blurred the line between reality and nightmare. Shadows darted at the periphery of my vision, flickering just out of reach, fueling my growing panic. I pressed onward, the laughter echoing ever louder, morphing into a cacophony of screams and giggles that twisted through the air. I could feel the energy intensifying, wrapping around me like a vice. As I rounded another corner, I stumbled into a large hall filled with a kaleidoscope of colors. Streamers hung from the ceiling, flickering lights casting erratic shadows across the room. At the center of the hall stood a massive carousel, its horses frozen in mid-gallop. The music played softly, a haunting melody that resonated in my bones. Drawn to the carousel, I stepped closer, entranced by the beauty of the ornate decorations. The horses glimmered with an ethereal glow, their eyes glinting with life as if they were waiting for someone to mount them. As I approached, the carousel began to turn, slowly at first, then gaining speed. The music swelled, enveloping me in its hypnotic rhythm. I felt a pull, an urge to join the dance, but something deep inside warned me against it. I turned to flee, but the exit had vanished, the walls of the hall shifting to confine me within. The laughter crescendoed, a cacophony of joy and despair that reverberated through the hall. I pressed my hands against the wall, desperately seeking a way out. The horses on the carousel neighed silently, their eyes watching me with a knowing gaze. I felt the ground tremble beneath my feet, the very essence of the fairground awakening to claim its next victim. Suddenly, the lights dimmed, and darkness enveloped the hall. My heart raced as I fought against the impending dread. I spun around searching for an escape, and in the darkness I glimpsed shadows swirling around me, forming shapes that were all too familiar. The laughter morphed into whispers, echoing the stories of those who had come before me, trapped in the cyclical torment of the fairground. With a surge of adrenaline, I dashed toward the nearest exit, the sound of the carousel behind me growing fainter as I burst through a door. I stumbled into the night air, gasping for breath, the stars above twinkling as if mocking my escape. The fairground stood silent behind me, a facade of rust and decay, but I could feel its gaze lingering, as if it were waiting for my return. As I stepped back onto the path, I could hear the laughter echoing faintly, a reminder of the darkness that lay beneath the surface of the abandoned fairground. I walked away, heart pounding, knowing that I had narrowly escaped the clutches of something far more sinister than I could comprehend. The thrill of adventure had become a haunting memory, a chilling reminder that some places are better left undisturbed, their secrets buried deep within the shadows.